Okay, welcome everyone. This is a webinar, Introduction to Qlik Sense Mashups. Today's presenter is Michael Wegman. He's a consultant at Infozone, and my name is Shima Ozins, and I'm today's host. So that being said, I will pass you the ball, Michael. Go ahead.
Perfect. Hi, everyone. As Shima said, my name is Michael Wegman, and I'm one of the consultants here at Infozone Intelligence. And today's webinar is just going to be a simple introduction into Qlik Sense mashups. So I'm planning on going over, first of all, what they are, the components that make them up, as well as brief what it takes to actually create a mashup. So what is a mashup? I feel like, especially around the Qlik Sense community around this time, this is really a buzzword that everyone's kind of talking about. But what actually is it? So in Qlik Sense terms, a mashup is a combination of the Qlik Sense open API, and it's injected into a web framework. So it's really a combination between Qlik Sense and websites, essentially. Now, why do we do this? Now, there are quite a few benefits, but just a couple. Is more user interface flexibility. So if you're currently using Qlik Sense, you may be frustrated with how limited the user interface can be. And I know that with every release, more and more features come out. But the plain simple truth is that right now, it's just not as flexible as far as the user interface as what QlikView might be. And so you can add, first of all, design flexibility. For example, if you want like a simple background color, and that's pretty much the most simple thing you can do. You can't do that in Qlik Sense currently. You could do that in the mashup. But even changing things like the color of titles and so much more, the possibilities for design really are endless with CSS, and we'll get into that a little bit later. And then second of all, function. So a lot of functionality isn't in Qlik Sense either. So for example, on open triggers, let's say you want, let's say you want a territory of the user to be selected when they open up the app. Right now, without an extension, that isn't possible with out-of-the-box Qlik Sense. You can do that kind of stuff with the JavaScript in a Qlik Sense mashup. But then also, mashups are cool because they allow you to insert sense into an already existing framework. So if you or your organization already has a web application, maybe with some other software that you're using to analyze data, you also have a Qlik Sense app, and you really like this one chart in that Qlik Sense app. Well, you can actually turn your existing web framework application that your organization is already using and knows and loves, and you can actually insert like a sense chart into a framework that you're already currently using. So let's go over some of the components of a mashup. So first of all, obviously, you have a Qlik Sense application. And now this application doesn't actually technically need any objects in it, and we'll go over that a little bit later. But all you really need is data. So basically, an application data model, you could have objects in it, or maybe you choose not to. And then second, some web development code files. So HTML, JavaScript, and then CSS. So this is kind of the infrastructure of a mashup. We have our Qlik Sense application in the top left corner, which feeds through JavaScript into our HTML, and then our CSS also goes into our HTML, and that is displayed in your web browser. And for those of you who aren't really familiar with web development, what is HTML, CSS, JavaScript? Well, those are kind of what I'm going to call the 3 F's of web development. So we have function, framework, and form. So we'll start with the HTML page there in the center. That's really the framework. An HTML file is a website in its most basic form. You can have text, you can have images in there, but all it really is a file that organizes different containers and the layout of that actual web page. And you see we have JavaScript, and that's more of the function. So you might navigate using JavaScript. You might show and hide objects with JavaScript. In a mashup sense, you can like make click selections using JavaScript, and that'll feed through the HTML file so that those selections and that those functions are seen. And then finally, on the bottom, we have CSS, and this is really the form. And so this is kind of where possibly user interface, graphic designers, this is kind of where they live in the CSS. This is your colors, your sizes, your shapes, the actual visual of it. So let's just do a simple example of how we can combine these web elements to actually create a mashup. So we have an input-output here. And so we'll start off with HTML. That's a little snippet of HTML code right there. So it's a div container, which is just an HTML container, and we gave it an ID called myDiv. And so if we put that in the input, boom, we officially have a website as our output. It might not look like a website. It's definitely not the most exciting website, but it is indeed a website. So let's make it more exciting. Let's add some CSS code to it. We'll reference that div ID. So you see hashtag myDiv there, and we'll give that container a height of 400 pixels, a width of 500 pixels. Let's also give it a background color. And so here, we can actually visually see that container now that's 400 pixels tall, 500 pixels wide, and has that nice mint green background color. So now let's actually make it a mashup and incorporate the JavaScript. So we can see we're creating this var app and actually calling the Qlik Sense engine in that first line. We're calling that app. You can see we're opening, since it's a local mashup, we're calling it mymashupapp.qvf, which is an actual Qlik Sense file that lives on my machine. And then in that second line, we're referencing that app. And each object in that app has an app ID, or sorry, excuse me, an object ID, which is in that second parameter on that second line. And then you'll see that we're attaching it to that myDiv ID from that HTML div. And boom, in the output, we officially have a mashup. And we can incorporate a line chart onto that web page. So that was just a very brief, simplified example, but I think you get the point. So now let's do this live. So I've created a very basic Qlik Sense app with some fake fast food sales in it. Let's say that the user has a requirement where they want a background color to this, and they want an image and a formattable title. Well, native Qlik Sense can't necessarily do this. It's fun. You can make selections in the pie chart and have a current selections bar, but it's still very limiting. So what we can do is we can go to the Dev Hub Mashup editor, and that you can get to from the hub. Just go to Dev Hub and create a mashup. And I've kind of sped up the process and created a really simple mashup template in here. But you'll see in this editor we have a preview. We're going to ignore this QEXT file for now. Then you'll also see where our HTML file lives, our JavaScript file, and our blank CSS file at the moment. And so we've already connected to our app. So in our JavaScript, you can go down and you can see that line of code that we actually saw in the previous slides. And now what's cool about this mashup editor when you have a template is that you can actually just drag and drop these visualizations from that app. And you see we added an image that lives in the HTML file and also a title. And we officially have a mashup. And what's also cool about this mashup editor is that we can add a current selections bar to it. Super easy on the bottom. We can check that show current selections bar. And now we can actually do our mashup on a web page. You'll notice that it can do all the same things, make selections. You can loop when you make selections with all the data, and those KPIs will change. And it's really actually talking to the Qlik Sense app to update these visualizations. One thing that is a little bit restricting with mashups is that you'll notice in the Qlik Sense app, when you right-click, you have all these nice export options, like export to PDF, export image, export data, whereas in the web mashup, you don't have that natively. Now you can add these using some JavaScript, but that's not necessarily quick or easy, but it definitely can be done. So now let's go back to what we wanted to do. We want to add a background image. So we'll go into our CSS, and we'll reference our body. And let's give it a background color. Say light goldenrod yellow. Why not? So we're referencing the body of the mashup, and we're giving it a background color of light goldenrod yellow, and we'll save it. And once we refresh this page, we now have a Qlik Sense mashup with a background color. And you can, that's just the most basic example you can pretty much do. But really, now that it's in this mashup, any object on this page can be edited with CSS. So let's say we want to edit that title. It's an H3 title. And let's say we want the color to be blue. I don't know if that's the best style choice, but we can try it out. And the title will be blue because the CSS feeds into the HTML. And you can also even reference these Qlik Sense titles and really make these objects look and feel the way you want them to. So some other functionality. So what we just did is we pulled objects that already existed in the Qlik Sense app and just basically injected them into a web framework. But you can also do a couple other things in a mashup by calling the Qlik API, and these are just a couple things. So lists, hypercubes, and objects on the fly. So we'll start with a list. Essentially, list is calling a field in Qlik Sense and put it in the JavaScript, and the JavaScript will read it and can kind of print it into the HTML. So essentially, you can make your own list box from a field, but because it's an HTML object, that you're actually creating, it's much more customizable, and you don't necessarily need to be restricted to the look and feel of that native Qlik Sense list box. Now you can print this list, so you could print all your field values, you could reference just one of them, and you can also, using JavaScript, the Qlik Open APIs, put a selection capability on those objects. A hypercube, this is basically a JavaScript function, and inside of it, it can actually read Qlik Sense expressions. Now this can be really handy when you're creating JavaScript variables or just printing the result of expressions in HTML. It basically creates a 3D cube in that 3D data cube in that JavaScript, and you can pinpoint areas on that cube, actually read Qlik Sense expressions through the JavaScript. And then finally, objects on the fly. Now this is kind of where I was saying technically you don't actually need any objects in a Qlik Sense app because you can create them all in JavaScript. Qlik has provided an API where a user could say, hey, make me a trend chart with this expression using this dimension and print it in the mashup, and it'll do that. Now this is really cool to an extent. If you have a very large mashup, I wouldn't necessarily recommend using this method, just because then all of your objects and all the expression code lives within the JavaScript. And if you ever want to change that, it's going to take someone who knows that JavaScript file or a web developer to go in and change the expressions if something ever needs to be modified. Whereas if you're just pulling in Qlik Sense objects, anytime you change a Qlik Sense expression within that app and save it, it'll feed through the mashup and it'll update. So just a little pro and con. But one possibility that's cool is, let's say you want a simple chart toggle. So kind of like a fast change in QlikView. Let's say the user wants to see a trend chart and then toggle the same data, but they want to see it in a table view. Well, right now you can't do that in Qlik Sense. And if you're using objects from the Sense and pulling them into the mashup, you would need to make a trend chart object and a table object in Sense and then hide and show them in the mashup. However, if you're creating an object on the fly, in the JavaScript, there's one line of code that basically says, hey, make this a trend chart. Well, theoretically, if you were to create a JavaScript variable with that, you could toggle that and say, hey, make a trend chart, and then toggle it to, hey, make a table. And so you're using the same expression, the same dimension, the same object, but you're actually toggling the different versions, but only having one object, which is kind of cool. And then finally, performance. So one issue that a lot of people have, I think, when they first start creating mashups is performance. And that's because not only do you need to have good Qlik Sense performance in your data model, but also you need to have good JavaScript performance and web performance. And one problem with this is that anytime you put an object into the mashup, that object is still connected to Qlik Sense and reading off of that Qlik Sense app. So the more objects that you put in, the more connections you have to that app, and the more objects listening to something, and they're being updated. And so with every object that you put in, the mashup becomes more slow and more slow. Now, one way you can get around this is by closing object models. So for example, if you have a single page mashup where you're just hiding and showing objects to kind of mimic navigation, let's say here, I think we have 6 objects. So we technically have 6 object models connected to Qlik Sense. So this isn't necessarily a data model, it's just kind of a connection to Qlik Sense, and those 6 objects are listening to that data model, looking for selections and updating expressions. So that's fine, but let's say you want to hide 2 of those items. Just because they're hidden on the page does not mean that those object models are closed, and we still have 2 connections to Qlik Sense that we don't necessarily need. So best practice is to close those object models so that only the objects that are shown on the page are connected to that Qlik Sense app. And then let's say you want to mimic navigation and hide these objects and show the other 2. We would close these object models and reopen the other 2 models to the Sense app so that only the objects shown are reading and calculating on the fly. And in the same vein, destroy session objects. Session objects are what we just talked about, the lists, the hypercubes, the objects on the fly, what you're not getting from Qlik Sense, but are actually being created within that web session. This is the exact same concept. The syntax is just different. It's destroy session objects. So thank you guys so much for listening. I know that was a lot in a little bit of time, but Shima, I think we're ready for Q&A.
Okay, great. Thank you, Michael. This is a very interesting topic personally for me, so I can just listen to it for another 30 minutes. But now the time is coming up, so if you have any questions, please type them into Q&A panel. And while you're typing the questions, I will introduce the next webinar. Next webinar is 2 weeks from today. John is going to talk about Endprinting 17.3 and Qlik Sense. And you will receive the email blast so that you can register for this session. And if you're not our email list, you can send me an email, Shima, or you can send me info@infozoneus.com and ask to be on that list. Or you can always go to our website, infozoneus.com, and go to the event. You will be able to see all the events that are listed out down there. And other webinars are Pharma and Qlik, a 23-year relationship. This is something that Phil Bishop, the president of Infozone, is going to talk about. His own experience working with the pharma industry together with the Qlik product. So there is something interesting that he will share with you. And then the next one after that is Anna Hedberg is going to talk about what's new in Qlik Sense. And by then, the version June 2017 will be out, so she will introduce you with the latest version of Qlik Sense. And all the webinars are recorded and posted on our Zone community portal. So if you go to the zone.infozoneus.com, you can go to the knowledge base page and filter to video, and you'll be able to see all the recordings that we have from these webinars. So that being said, I will open up for Q&A panel, Q&A session. So let's see. Okay, Michael, the first question that I have is, what happens if extensions and widgets are pulled into a mashup?
Sure. So this is a really common question. Extensions and widgets, if they are in the native Qlik Sense app that you're pulling, they'll pull in just like any other object that you have in that Qlik Sense app. So extensions and widgets will pull into Mashups. One thing that you need to note, and this is in a regular Sense app too, that if you're using extensions and widgets and you're publishing to server, make sure that those extensions and widgets are published to the QMC so that the mashups on the server can read them as well.
Okay. The next question is, you mentioned a single page mashup, but are you able to create multiple mashups? Multi-page mashups?
Sure. So, yeah, well, I should say yes and no. So a single page mashup is usually recommended as long as you're closing those object models and performance is good. Because with the multi-page mashup, a lot of times the current selection state will be erased. So, and maybe that's something you want. In that case, a multi-page mashup is good if you want every page to start out as a fresh session. But if you are looking at kind of an app navigation and you want your selections to stick for your different navigation to different pages, that's not the case in a multi-page mashup, so I wouldn't recommend that.
Okay. The next question is, do you think that Qlik Sense Mashup will provide all the visual components to replace QlikView for guided navigation? I mean, Qlik Sense is more for Auto Explorer, while QlikView is more for top management and to guide them on the navigation.
Sure. I think that is definitely a possibility, and I think mashups are definitely kind of an answer to bridge the gap between Qlik Sense and QlikView functionality. To be honest, I can't say this 100%, but I think a mashup can do, in the end, anything that QlikView could do. And so I do think that it is a good solution if your organization is switching over to Qlik Sense, but you still want QlikView functionality.
Okay.
Does that answer the question?
And I'm waiting for the person to respond, but I believe so. And then, as you said, you don't have to have objects from Qlik Sense, right, in the mashup. You can utilize the data model and then only use the data on the mashups too. So the sky is the limit, I suppose, with the mashup.
Yeah,
okay.
Exactly.
The next question is, what is the best practice when you need to have different selections on each page, bookmarks or hypercubes?
When you need to have different selections on each page. So in that, I'm assuming you mean when you navigate to another page, things would be cleared and fields would be auto-selected, possibly like an on-open trigger. As far as best practice, you could go with a single page or a multi-page mashup in that case if fields are truly being cleared and switched over to selection. I tend to prefer single page because usually 90% of the time there's some field that's universal and that users want to see over and over depending on the page. But the best practice would be when you click on the navigation to have that button talk to the Qlik API and clear whatever field is selected, and then it can also select another field or value that you want. And you can use the hypercubes even to kind of work as section access and to create a variable in that depending on the user. And that hypercube can set a variable. You can close the hypercube and the variable will still be set in JavaScript so that hypercube isn't open anymore. And then based on that JavaScript variable, you can make that page selection.
Okay. The next question is, so you show the Dev Hub Mashup editor. Is this something you created or does it come with the product?
Sure. So in the Dev Hub, I believe there are a few templates that come native with the Dev Hub. I'm sure you can also find templates on something like Qlik Branch. But the one that we actually saw, I created. And basically, to create that, I just made the blank HTML file and then put in placeholder divs in there for that drag and drop. Usually you wouldn't even have to do that. If you're making those placeholder divs anyway, you might as well just inject the object as you're doing the HTML code. But there are a few examples and templates, I believe, in the native Dev Hub for mashups.
Okay, so Dev Hub is something that Qlik Sense installs together with the product.
Yes, so if you go to the hub, let me just check to make sure I'm saying this right. Do
you want to share your screen?
No, just 'cause I don't want to show off all my apps.
Okay.
But if you go to the hub, in the upper right-hand corner, there are 3 dots, and then you can select Dev Hub from there. And it's if it's your local version, it's just localhost 4848/dev hub instead of /hub.
Okay.
And that's dev-hub.
Good. Okay, maybe I can show this very quickly. So let's see if I can share my screen. Okay. Okay, so I hope you can see my screen. So this is what you're talking about, right? So Dev Hub on that. Okay. Okay, great. So this is what you see. Okay, great. I'm not seeing any other questions at the moment. Let me just check one more time. Okay, one more. So for mobile applications, would you say mashups are better to navigate or not?
For mobile applications, that really depends on the layout of the application. But I think mashups could be good for mobile applications, especially because you can, I know Qlik Sense, they say that you can view your app on any screen, whether it's desktop or mobile. But really, you can't really control the way those objects are being wrapped. And so depending on the metadata that you have to kind of develop in rows versus columns because the objects will wrap that way. So mashups are really great for like a mobile application, especially if you're developing for multiple screens, because with the CSS and the HTML, you can control the wrap of that text. And you can control, you know, the size of the buttons and have that be dynamic for, let's say, if you're going from a desktop to mobile. So you can essentially have the same app on both devices. So yeah, I would recommend a mashup for mobile.
Great. Okay, I'm not seeing any other questions coming in anymore, so I think we're all set. Thank you, Michael, for presenting today's very interesting topic about mashups. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining today. Officially, we're closing this session. Thank you.